So it's a few minutes before 11 a.m. and it's time for Bill Sohne to give his presentation. Bill has been a massive Chelsea fan for I don't know how long, but he's also a great history buff, and he likes to research stories behind some of the clocks that he gets from unusual places that have inscriptions on them and things. And Bill's a moderator and does a lot of different things on the internet. He's been around forever. But at this point, I'm actually going to walk over to our Chelsea clock display with my mobile phone and let Bill take a look at some of the clocks that we have and maybe make some comments on them. So I'm going to go over to the display now. Okay, Bill, you can see our white display board here with some clocks on it.
Nice. I think they're great. I think, like I said, I always think of Chelsea's as the millionaire's clock and as the working man's clock. What's great, I see a combination of both types here, where you see that little one on the left there, that's Manhattan. That would be that's it. Okay, now you're focused on that first little clock. That time only, that's a Manhattan yacht clock. That could be on a dash of a small boat or something, or inside the cabin. That, could be considered a millionaire's type of clock or a civilian clock, as opposed to the one on the right. I think it says Lake Lines on the dial, which is a Great Lakes shipping company, and that's a radio room clock. So once again, that's a working man's clock. But what's really great, basically the same movement could be a millionaire's clock or a working man's clock. And that's what I love about these. That's what I love about Chelsea in general. This is also a radio room clock where it has silence between 15 and 18 and 45 and 48 after the hour to listen for emergency signals. That is basically brought about from the Titanic disaster. So that was put into play. This is a U.S. government on the right to that, Tim, is a U.S. government 8-day, 24-hour clock. You'd see those anywhere from the 50s through the 90s, being government installations. Scroll down, that is a maritime commission or a later maritime administration ship spell. So that was a merchant marine ship spell clock. Also great. I mean, these are the type of pieces you could find at a regional, and it has the same quality movement as that clock below there. Tim, do you know how big that bezel is? I mean, either the dial or that whole case, that either looks like a 10-inch bezel or maybe a little bigger. That looks as an earlier ship spell. That would be a civilian type of piece that could be in a millionaire's house, as opposed to, but the same movement between that millionaire's clock and that maritime commission clock. Same high quality movement. It's okay. Then you can knock down the sign. That's fine. That's a later clock and barometer set, probably from the 60s or later. It has a cutoff by the 8 o'clock, so it doesn't have to strike. Over here, that's a beautiful clock. That's an early marine clock. Tim, can you hear me? Because you're muted on your phone, and I don't know if your mic is live, but that could be a 10 or a 12-inch clock. And I can't tell, that's really kind of hard to do. Gotcha. How big was that one that was on the table there?
It's at least 10, maybe 12.
And 12 inches over. If it's 12 inches overall, you saying?
Probably.
That's probably a 10-inch clock. That's a great clock. That's a great, very uncommon clock. As opposed to Chelsea made, let's say, almost 1 million clocks to date. Out of the 1 million clocks they made 10 and 12-inch clocks in under 1,000 in each size, whether it be a wall or a shelf clock. So to find anything large, a 10 or a 12-inch dial, and like I said, a 10-inch dial would have a 12-inch case. 12-inch dial would have about a 14 or 14.5-inch wide case. If you go back up to the Navy clock, Tim, to the left, that was on the stand. No. You were right there. Go back. That one right there. That is an early deck clock, and it has a number, an N number, showing that it was actually purchased through the Naval Observatory, and they timed it before it was deployed. So it has an NO number on it, which is great. That is a 6-inch deck clock that from what I can tell, without knowing the serial number, is pre-World War One. You know, this what's great about these clocks, these marine clocks. A lot of the things that you see on that table were built and running and hanging on a wall before the Titanic even sank, or before the Titanic keel was even laid. I mean, it's really amazing how well the marine clocks survive in comparison to a lot of the. And please don't take offense to this. I refer to all tall case, all wooden clocks as firewood clocks. Okay, and I refer to marine clocks as tuna cans. So it's anybody's ball game. That's more of a wooden tambour. That's a great book. That's Andy Demeter's first edition in the blue cover. The second edition, and they're both out of print. So if you can find one, it's great. And this is the second edition of the same book. And it has a couple more charts and some more serial number information in the second edition. But if you can find a first edition of the book, it's well worth picking up. I highly recommend it. I highly recommend reading it, or at least thumbing through it. And you have some early catalogs, and I have some pictures of my presentation. You have the manual, looks like one of the manuals on the right there for take apart. The catalogs are great to look at, so you can see the depth and breadth of their product offerings over the years. And you have a manual back there that was for probably World War II for doing what is that? Tim, focus on the big document to your left. Yeah, so that's for mechanical boat and deck clocks. These were from probably World War II. And it's great. It's one of the best ways if you want to take one of these apart. You can find a copy. You can find a copy either at the regionals, or I think, you know what, if you do a search online for a PDF, this stuff is all in the public domain at this point, and you get a PDF copy of a take apart manual for the time onlys and for the striking clocks. So there's a lot of information out there. You need to Google it, and Google really is your friend in this case. And okay, Tim, let's continue with what you got with your show and tell. So if you go to the right, that is a great desk set, and it's kind of uncommon. What are those, 4-inch dials? 3.5-inch dials. The hardest thing on these is you want to make sure you have the barometer, and it's easy to test the barometer. You can put a clear plastic bag over it. You can get the needle to deflect a little by pressuring against the air. But you always want to make sure that those glass thermometers are working, because if they're not, it's almost impossible to get a replacement for that. Other than that, it's a great desk set. And what I really like about it, it's time only. It's a non-striking set, which is nice. And it sets and winds from the back. That's probably like a 3.5-inch dial on that set. It's a very nice set. The next piece you have there is a convertible piece, actually. It can be used it would come with an outer rectangular case that would mount onto a dash of a boat or a car. And it's lockable. So you could have a clock locked in, and then when you want to take it inside, it also has little peg legs on it. It can be used as a nightstand clock. So that's kind of a cool piece. That looks like a Boston Clock Company clock. Is that one yours, Tim?
And
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's uncommon to actually see Boston Clock Company on the dial. So it's kind of nice to see that. That's a Queen Anne style clock. This is pre-Chelsea. Boston Clock Company became the remnants of it later on became Chelsea. This is a great clock. I love these. These are chronoquartzes, and this was a high-tech development in the 80s with Chelsea, and I think it was D.A. Little in Boston, where if you open it up, you can see it has a mechanical time train. Uh-oh.
This one's been swapped out.
Uh-oh. At the little black plastic stuff. We don't like that. Basically, what this originally had in it was basically a time only mechanical movement that Chelsea worked with, I want to say DH Little in Boston, to instead of having a spring barrel and a balance wheel platform, they actually mounted a high tech, high quality quartz stepping motor where the factory would guarantee accuracy of, I want to say, 2 minutes a year on the clock. And it had a lifetime warranty. So if you could find a chrono quartz out there, you pop open the back. It's really, really cool. It's just sad that somebody swapped the movement out of this one. Oh, that's a hip fake. And that's another Queen Anne style carriage clock or traveling clock, depending on who you talk to. And that's like, I forget the wooden model of that. That's probably a house strike. It's probably a 5.5-inch dial. And I mean, Chelsea was known as the timekeepers of the sea. And later on, they started producing more civilian style pieces, more firewood style pieces like you see in that shelf clock. And I think that's all of them, Tim.
Okay, I'm good. Gonna head back to the table now, and you can start your presentation.
Okay, am I live? I'm live on that audio. I guess
Yes,
I am.
You're live.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Bill. Just having a cup of coffee. I am talking to you from Brooklyn, New York, in my son's bedroom. So, it is what it is. I'm here to talk about Chelsea clocks, and I'm here to spread the passion. Just so you know a little about me, I'm a long-time vintage watch guy, and I've been collecting vintage watches since the 80s. I'm also got into collecting Chelsea marine clocks shortly thereafter that, probably in the early 90s. So I'm one of the few people that is a vintage watch nut and a clock nut all rolled up in one person. I'm also the moderator of the NAWCC official Facebook group. You'll see me on there. I also moderate a marine clock group on Facebook called Marine Clocks and Ships Clocks, aka Things with Springs. I'm also a moderator over at Omega Forums. I'm well known as a vintage Omega watch and Zenith watch collector. So with that, let's talk about Chelsea clocks and let's spread the passion. Okay, we got it. Okay, so let's talk about, I'm a collector at heart. I'm not a dealer. I have my daytime job has nothing to do with anything I do here. So we'll leave it at that. I've been collecting phonographs, comic books, coins, stamps. I mean, I've been a collector since I was a kid. And the one thing I want to make sure, and I want to reiterate to everybody that the number of items a collector has does not make or break you as a collector. It's all about the passion. I know collectors out there that have a book on the subject and they can't, either financially or due to the fact they don't have the space to even have one clock or one watch or one whatever. Okay, so it's all about the passion. It doesn't make a difference if you have one clock, one watch, 10 clocks, 10 watches. We're all collectors. We could all be as passionate. Like I said before, I'm a moderator at Omega Forums. I've been a moderator for a watch forum since the early 90s. I'm also the admin for the NAWCC Facebook group. And I'm also the admin of the Marine Clock Ships Clock group, that's AKA Things with Springs Facebook group. So why Chelsea? A couple of things that I like about Chelsea Clock Company. It's really the last American clock company that's still in continuous business. It's been operating continuously since 1897. It created the first commercially successful 8-day ship's bell movement. It has made over 900 movies, probably close to a million at this point. And what I love about this, because I would argue with people online how Chelsea's horrible. I call them and they say they won't sell me a part. And I said, why don't you call Seth Thomas and ask to see if you can buy a part from them? And well, there's nobody to call. I said, that's the difference. You could call the Chelsea Clock Company and they still answer the phone. And I think it blows my mind that that's even there. And they do have a full repair and vintage restoration department that is now being ran by a young gentleman named Patrick Mont, who is extremely passionate about Chelsea as a company, and he's probably the next historian going forward that he's going to carry the torch. And it's great that he's at the company working and steering the restoration and vintage repair division there. And the other thing that's great is, remember we were talking about the serial number on your clock? You could call up Chelsea and you can get a certificate of origin, because they actually have, or they have not only movement production information, but they also have a sales ledger that lists the serial number, when it was sold, and who the original seller was, or the original buyer was, excuse me. And, you know, you can get a lot of that without getting their certificate, because if you buy a clock and it has not just Chelsea's name on it, but the dealer's name on it, then you know it was sold to that dealer. And if you look at the serial number up through looking at Andy's books, in the back of Andy's book, you could figure out probably within a year or so when it was sold. So, I mean, it's great that you can actually make a phone call and you can buy a certificate from the company, and they're still in business, and this information is out there. Now, Chelsea made a couple of different types of movements. Their marine clock movement, which is known as a Type E, which is basically the original gangster marine movement that was used since the Harvard Clock Company in 1880, which is the round movement that you see on the left. Okay. Later on, they came out about 6 years later with a rectangular movement known as the Type F movement, aka the pilot house. And these would be in time-only movements. These could either be in large clock cases or down to about a 6-inch case. And they're uniquely identifiable because they have a very large sub-second bit, which is just under 2 inches. Chelsea's main claim to fame was the ship spell clock. This was the first commercially successful 8-day ship spell. They refer to it internally as a Type L movement. And later iterations such as an ASB, 2L, or the 4L product. ASB stands for, in the right here, you'll see it is known as the automatic striking ship spell. And basically what that had was an additional brake circuit on the back of the clock where you could wire up, and you see the terminals on top of the clock here, to an external bell that you could have on the far side of the yacht or outside the yacht club, and it could strike, and it could control that as a remote bell for striking ship spells throughout either the boat, the clubhouse, your giant yacht, what have you. So, and that was patented and released in about 1911, where the original clock, the original L movement, came out in 1900. And like I said, there were other 8-day ship spell clocks made previous to that. Tiffany makers made a bespoke setup that made about 20 or 18 of them. I mean, it was not a commercially successful product. It was sold as one-offs. This is actually made in serial production, and that's where Chelsea got the term the timekeeper of the sea. And here's the ship's, here's an early, not the earliest, but this is an early version of the 4 movement that has a direct train escapement. Later versions, such as the 4L, would have a platform escapement right here. So there'd be an open hole in this plate, and the entire platform could drop it and pull out for faster service. You could see they were pretty good about service issues, because the lower plate up front here basically is used. This could have been a single plate going across the whole front of this clock, But Chelsea figured out that if we can create a split plate here, these three screws, when removed, will give you full access to replace spring barrels without mucking with the time or the strike train of the clock. So, there's some economies here to make it usable. This is just a great takeaway or an exploded view of a 4L movement. You can see it's kind of hard, but you can see it's a platform escapement here. And this is from Chelsea's website. And Chelsea's been making this clock basically the same for over 100 years. If you have questions, just, I guess, save them for the end right now. Or if there's something really burning, get Tim's attention. I have no problem stopping what I'm talking about. And we can talk whatever you guys want to talk about. If I'm going too fast, let me know. If I'm going too slow, let me know. I still have a half a cup of coffee. So the way Chelsea did sales early on, they were just trying to earn a living. So they would sell multiple different ways. They had OEM sales of movements to steam gauge companies because, 1899, 1898, that's the explosion of the industrial age or the Gilded Age, or the ending of the Gilded Age. Steam power was the pinnacle. Anything that was done with steam. So steam gauge companies were pretty big. And steam gauge companies would provide gauge boards for power plants, for buildings, for ships. And among the gauges on that gauge board, one of them, most likely, you'd be offered, hey, do you want a clock for your gauge board? And they would go through and say, we could offer you a Chelsea movement, a Seth Thomas movement, an E. Howard movement, a Yankee movement. And depending on what movement you got, the price would be accordingly. And they'd make a case. The steam gauge company would make the case, make the dial, sometimes make the hands. Okay? And the reason is they'd make the case and dial and match the rest of your gauge board. So if it was a deep case or a shallow case, everything would match and look the same. So that's why there's a lot of times you'll see a clock out there that will say, let's say Maryland, this one says Maryland Steel, and it says Star Brass down here, I think. Can't tell in my picture, it's a little small. And that's who made the clock. Now, conversely, as Chelsea started getting steam going and, basically getting some sales going, they'd start offering clocks that was a complete clock made by Chelsea. So they would have either buy their cases from a foundry or from a steam gauge company. They'd make their own dials, and the dials would say Chelsea Clock Company. And notice this would say Chelsea on it. It would say ship spells in this case. This happens to be a library clock. This is a shelf clock that was the difference between a steam gauge clock and a Chelsea clock, they could both have a Chelsea movement. But it gets down to the nitpicky that when you order the clock, you're buying it from Chelsea. So Chelsea is offering and selling a complete clock, whether it be a wall clock or a shelf clock, as opposed to selling a movement to a steam gauge company, and then they would assemble in one of their cases in one of the dials they've constructed. And Chelsea, started ship chandlers, nautical supply houses like John Bliss, Charles Hutchinson in Boston. One of their earliest dealers was Tiffany and Company, and other jewelers such as Riggs Brothers down in Philly. I think Riggs Brothers was, I think, a jewelry store. I'm not sure. I forget. But you have companies like Orm in Pittsburgh. You would have other companies like Spalding in Chicago buying clocks from Chelsea. And sometimes it would say Chelsea on the dial. And sometimes it would say Chelsea on the dial and the jeweler. Or sometimes it would just say the jeweler on the dial. But like I said, those are complete clocks that were sold by Chelsea for either resale or direct sale, versus movements that were sold to steam gauge companies that had come out in a steam gauge clock. So this gets back to the point where we're talking about the difference between a working man's clock and a millionaire's clock. We go back to this for a second. You'll see most of these clocks were in ships, buildings, locomotives, power plants. These were where working men were working. As opposed to something like this was a very fancy clock, and it more than likely would be on a millionaire's shelf. If this was a time-only version of this shelf clock, it would probably have the same exact movement in both clocks. And that's really what I find to be stunning about Chelsea, that it was a working man's clock and a millionaire's clock. The only difference would be the size of the dial and the fit and finish of the case. And you can see, I'll give you an example. You can see prices of like a ship's bell. The ship's bell clock here, even a 4.5-inch dial one was $42. Just to give you an idea, this is a 1910, 1911 catalog page. Okay, $42 for a 4.5-inch ship's bell clock. Now, that's not going to be in every person's home, because in 1911, if you were a police officer in New York City, your annual salary was about $1,000. So, nobody's going to be, no working man is going to be buying a Chelsea clock. But you'd find these in everywhere where people would be working. So, on ships, merchant marines, the sailors, the Navy, the Army. So what's great about it, the same clock, same movement. The only difference would be the size of the dial and the fit and finish of the case. So, the working man's using the same equipment as the millionaire. And I think it's stunning. The movements were generational. These things would last forever. And I mean, I said, don't judge a collector by the number of clocks he owns. Okay. It's all about the passion, but I own a few and I love them. I got a 10 by 10 room with 11-foot ceilings filled with these things. And once again, we're just showing you more of the different catalogs. Remember on that last page, we showed a ship's bell. Here is the top version of the ship's bell that was on a commander case or mahogany and metal base with what's known as the special grand dial, which would have an inlaid medallion with applied numbers and serpentine hands. And same movement as that 4.5-inch ship's bell for $42. But if you look at a special grand and a 4.5-inch, which I've never seen one, by the way, is $66. Okay. And these are millionaire clocks. So the stuff you find at a regional, you'll see stuff. I've seen stuff like this at regionals selling for hundreds of dollars. And I'll tell you, they're great. And I make fun of tall case clocks. I call them firewood. I do it every day of the week. I refer to my marine clocks when I have too many to put up. I stack them up on a shelf. They look like tuna cans. And, it's all about being passionate about the hobby. So basically, we're talking about what's the big difference between a working man's clock and a millionaire's clock. And it's basically the dial. And you can see, the dial, so you have plain, special grand. And I could show you that real quick. These are your plain dials. And it could be Arabic or Roman numerals with just moon hands or gay hands, depending on who you talk to about them. Then they come up with a special dial that has applied numbers, applied Arabics with the serpentine hands. Then you have the special grand, where you have the applied numbers, the serpentine hands, and the golden medallion, typically a golden medallion in the center. And I have some colored pictures of these type of clocks farther in the presentation. And if I'm going too slow, go like this, guys, and I'll speed up. If you have a question, let Tim know, and we'll try to answer them in kind. And once again, we're talking about, what's the big difference? We're talking about the dial. Talk about a wall clock versus a shelf clock. So something on the same. If these were the same size dial, let's say 6-inch, okay. Typically, a shelf clock has more value than a wall clock. Okay, and then there's the difference between a steam gauge clock versus a Chelsea complete clock, where steam gauge is typically always a wall clock, and sometimes you'll see a pedestal if it was a presentation piece. But what I like about this, And this is something that is lost on a lot of people. Most of the wall clock you see out there pre 1900 or steam gauge company assembled clocks. Really uncommon to find a wall clock that has Chelsea on the dial before 1900. It's almost impossible because they came in 1898. But I'm saying like E. Howard. It's uncommon to find a wall clock that says E. Howard. Typically, most wall clocks should have an E. Howard movement in it, but it would say, Maryland Steel Company, Bethlehem Steel Company, Four Rivers Engineering. It would be whatever the name of the works was that the clock was being fabricated for. So that's something to think about. So that's why most of that stuff was always a working man's clock. Getting back to the dial styles, here's a single page showing a plain silver dial, a special dial, and a special grand dial. They refer to as a Pierce center. Size, in some cases, does matter. What you see here, you see two wheel clocks with mahogany metal bases. Otherwise, I refer to these as wheel commanders. It was used that term was used once or twice, I found, in sales ledger references at Chelsea. It's a term of endearment for me, but it basically says it's a mahogany metal base, which Chelsea later called the Commander, and it's a wheel clock. And the one in the lower right-hand corner is the smallest striking with ship's fellows. It's a special dial with special hands, and that's a 3 3/4 inch dial. Okay. The clock in the background, that clock dial is 12 inches. And just to give you an idea of overall size, the clock in the back stands about 30 inches tall. From the 9 o'clock spoke to the 3 o'clock spoke is 24 inches. And the clock probably weighs close to 80 pounds. But it has the same exact movement as this little one does. It's just bigger. And this also has the automatic ship's bell brake circuit. And so, to give you an idea, this clock sold in 1913. The base clock was about $166, this configuration. But they added that brake circuit, which was new technology at the time. It added $100 for this clock. So this clock retailed for about $266 in 1913, which was probably one of the most expensive. The only thing you get more expensive than that is if you got one with a special brand dial. So have this dial swapped out to special brand, and instead of a plain wooden base here, it would be carved. And that'd probably put it over $300. But this is probably one of the most expensive Chelsea clocks sold in 1913. Steam gauge versus a Chelsea clock. You can see here on the steam gauge clock, it will say Ashcroft, which is a steam gauge company. The clock on the left was late World War I, probably 1916 in this case. This used one of those F movements because it has that almost 2-inch sub-second bit that I was telling you about, that rectangular time-only movement. This one was for the U.S. Navy, and it's also signed Chelsea Clock Company, Boston, USA. And the case is also signed Chelsea Clock Company, where in the steam gauge clock, there's nothing wrong with this. This is an Ashcroft clock. Dial signed Ashcroft. The case is typically not signed. The movement would be an OEM movement that was purchased from the Chelsea Clock Company in this case. A tool clock versus a fancy clock. Okay. So we're talking about, remember Tim showed one of these. This is a U.S. Maritime Commission's clock. This is a 4L. It has a micrometric regulator. So this is probably a 1950s example. You'd find this in any merchant marine ship. It's a working man's clock or a tool clock. Conversely, what you see on the right is basically the same clock, but this has a mahogany and metal base. This is a special grand dial. So it has that pierced medallion center, applied numerals, and serpentine hands. And this is actually as found an original finished clock. I actually got this from a seller in Colorado a couple of years ago. The difference is this clock you could find at any regional for probably under $500. This clock, I've only seen 4 in all my collecting. In my 20 some odd years, I've only come across 4 examples of this. 2 are ship spell and 2 are house strikes. And I know a collector in Colorado has a house strike version of this, and he's saying that's the last clock he's going to keep before he passes away. Just so you know, these are real. The only difference between these two, or the thing that's basically the same between these 2 clocks, is the same high quality ship spell movement. This is a tool clock. This is a working man's clock. This is the epitome of a millionaire's clock. And the stuff's out there. I hear stories, people go to regionals, they call me all the time and say, Bill, what do you think of this? And he shows me a clock that looks like this one, but bigger. And he got it for like $1,500. And I said, that's like a lottery ticket. I mean, the stuff's out there. It's fun. And, you know, Tim was mentioning I love clocks with stories. And I always like, you know, if I could find something and dig into it, I do. In this case, this happens to be a working man's clock. This happens to be a 10-inch dial. The overall size is about 12 inches. And remember, when we get to 10-inch dial clocks and 12-inch dial clocks, Chelsea made almost 1 million clocks. But when you get to the 10 and 12-inch size clocks, they made very few of them. They made less than 1,000. Some people say less than 600 of each. And most of them were made before 1950. So anytime you see a 10-inch clock, whether it be a wall clock or a shelf clock, it's super uncommon. Same thing with any 12-inch Chelsea. If it's a shelf clock or a wall clock and it's 12 inches, really uncommon. Less than 1,000 made in over 100 years. Oh, and think of it this way. 1 million clocks made, they made less than 1,000 of them in that size, whether it be a wall and or shelf. So that's just something to think about. In this case, I bought this from a fellow NAWCC collector a couple of years ago. He is in the Midwest. I got the clock from him. Glass cracked in transit. That happens. And I did research on the serial number. And this clock was sold to Great Lakes Engineering. I forget the year. And I was able to look up Great Lakes Engineering, and they made 4 boats that year. They made a tugboat, a trash trawler, and 2 Lakers. And one of the Lakers was the William G. Mather. And William G. Mather is now a museum. And this clock was sold to them right when they were outfitting the William G. Mather. So I said, there's a chance that this clock could have been purchased to be put on that freighter. So I had a buddy of mine, Mark Dusky, who lives out in the Great Lakes. And he's telling me, hey, Bill, I'm going to go to the museum. I said, you're going to go to the William G. Mather Museum? He goes, yeah. I said, great, Mark, do me a favor. Take some photos in the pilot house and let me know if you see a spot where maybe this clock could have fit. And the problem was, it was already late September, and the museum closes for the season mid-October, and he missed getting there before it closed for the season. And he goes, well, I'll go next year. I said, okay. And I get a call from him in May of the next year. Say, hey, Bill, you know, I'm at the William G. Mather, but I forgot. You wanted me to take pictures of something for you. And I reminded him, and he did. And he sent me the photos. And here is the pilot house of that Laker. And you can see that there is a clock up here. That's nice. So that, that's where the clock probably was. So he got me a couple of zoom-ins of it. And you can see it says donated by the students of Ridgebrook Elementary, Parma, Ohio in 91. But if you notice that there's a halo or a ring going around here, this is a 6-inch clock. If you look at this halo, it goes around, and there hole, and a hole. That's where that 10-inch clock originally was. And that I refer to that as a smoking gun. So I love looking at pieces and trying to figure out where they could have been used. Here's another clock that was a mystery. It's an uncommon. What I found, this is up for sale. Actually, it was on eBay. And what was really cool about it, the case was made out of aluminum. And I find anytime I see a Chelsea clock or a Marine clock in an aluminum case, I always look twice. I always try to buy it because I just think it's cool and it's different. In this case, this aluminum clock, I called up Chelsea, and they actually gave me a picture of what says in the record page. It says it's a 4L, which is a ship spell. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. But it also says it was sold to Southwestern Instruments, and the guy I bought it from said it came off of a Pan Am clipper ship. So I said, oh, that's sad. But all of a sudden, you can see it said a duplicate serial number was used on 6/13/1950, and it was sold to Pan Am World Airways Systems. And it was a 3 3/4 4L in an aluminite finished 4L hinged bezel, which is exactly what this is. So part of it was the guy said it was sold to Pan Am and it was used on a flying boat clipper ship. Said, well, now I was able to determine from the date it wasn't used on a flying boat because they got rid of their flying boats in the late 40s. And this clock was purchased in 1950. So that wasn't the case. Turns out that if it was used in a Pan Am clipper, it was used in clipper N103007V. I was able to reach out to the Pan Am Historical Society, and I asked them if they had any photos of, this is the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, which was based on the B-29 airframe. And it had a lounge downstairs. And if you notice right here, that's where that clock was used. In the downtown lounge, in the downstairs lounge on the B-377 Stratocruiser. And what was also really interesting about this clock, hold on, I did more research. This clock, I would assume it was still on the plane at the time. Pan Am flew to Antarctica, and this clock was on that plane. So the one civilian flight that went to Antarctica was done by Pan Am on a 377, I want to say in the late 50s. And I've done this research since I created this presentation, but I just want to add that to this. And I also found another clock that wasn't in aluminum, but it was in a presentation it was in a presentation mount with a Cartier plate on it, presented to Virginia Warren in 1949. Virginia Warren was the daughter of then Governor Warren of California, later was the Supreme Court Justice. And it was presented to Virginia Warren on the inauguration of the first flight of the Stratocruiser from San Francisco to Honolulu. And this was the flying clipper ship spells clock. And I haven't even written my article on that yet. I've just been dealing with too many other things, but it's so much fun that you can find a clock, and this stuff pops up at regionals. I wish I was at Rocky Mountain right now. I'd be fighting with Tim, fighting with Dave Resnick, trying to grab stuff. Here's another large dial working man's clock. And to boot, it's an aluminum case and it uses an E movement. And this was sold to the Four Rivers Shipbuilding in Quincy, Mass. At the time, Four Rivers Shipbuilding was a division of Bethlehem Shipping. And this acetate is stamped on the back of the case of the clock. For it to be out of aluminum, I'm not sure. It would have to be used in an area where there'd be no possible ferrous interference, maybe in a radio room or in a navigational array room or some sort, where you wouldn't have any effects of magnetism or sparking or something. So this is one of those uncommon things where it's a large dial and it's a working man's clock. Here's a large dial millionaire's clock. With this also has a pilot house movement, but they did away with the large seconds bit. It has a special dial with applied numbers. From edge to edge, the bezel of that clock is 12 inches. It's sitting in a third-party cradle. This is definitely a millionaire's clock. This is something that a millionaire would have in their home. And it's basically the same as this, but this was in some sort of military application. So, I love the idea that the Chelsea clock could be a millionaire's clock, and it's also the working man's clock. Now here's a shot of 4 special grand dial commanders. And they range from 6 inches to 8.5 to 10 to 12. And this 12 is the first 12-inch special grand dial commander ever made. It's the lowest serial number. Really uncommon. Why did I put this photo up? I'm showing off a little. I'm flexing because I could. And I don't think there's anybody else in the country that can give a photo like that, to create a photo like that. So I'm kind of proud of it. Here's some more non-typical working man's clocks. Once again, most shelf clocks are really millionaire's clocks. The first picture on the left is as found before any restoration was done. If I would have found the clock, I probably would have just put a new seconds hand on it and just left it as it was. But it's not the case. My friend Chester Hicks actually acquired this clock and he restored it to what you see on the right. And I said, boy, I'd like to buy that from you, Chester. He goes, well, a lot of people would, but I sold it years ago. And last year, this popped up on auction. I was able to pick it up. And Chester just laughed. Yeah, I guess you did get the clock. I said, yeah, I'm like a Canadian Mountie. I always get my man. But what's great about this piece, two things that are really uncommon. One, it's time only. Most shelf clocks Chelsea makes are always striking. So to find something time only, it's already uncommon. What's really uncommon about this one, this was not a millionaire's clock. You can see this is the Recorder of Deeds of Providence, Rhode Island. It was in their office. So this is a very fancy working man's clock. So this is a non-typical working man's clock that's out there. And I think it's stunning, and I love it. Once again, it's in my quarters room of hell, as my wife says. Here's another large dial working man's clock. I found this at the York Regional, sitting on a table. It wasn't in black oxide at the time. It was all shiny red brass. And this is a 10-inch clock. And I was able to get Chelsea records, and this was done through a third party. He was able to get me a copy of the sales ledger page, and here's the serial number 52604. It was sold on 4/25/10 to the Long Island Railroad Company, and it was black oxide, marine, non-magnetic, and that's what this is. It's a non-magnetic. Non-magnetic was an extra $1 to have a non-magnetic hairspring and balance installed to the cost of the clock. And I did more research. I go, why would the Long Island Railroad need a 10-inch marine clock with non-magnetic? I mean, if it was for a station, they could just use a regulator. regular pendulum regulator. There's no, firewood clock. There's no reason for a marine clock in an environment like that. And then I noticed it was black oxide. And I started looking at all the 10-inch clocks that were painted in black oxide. Out of the 30 that were made between, because we have this detailed information until about 1915, 1916, then they got lazy in the sales ledger and didn't write all the detailed information that you see on the right here. Out of 30 clocks that were sold with black oxide and non-magnetic, 28 of them were sold to power generating companies like Pittsburgh Power, Westinghouse Electric, Consolidated Edison, and railroads. And I overlaid this time, the dates. And at the time, in April of 1910, New York City, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Long Island Railroad was constructing Pennsylvania Station. And from what I can tell, Long Island Railroad bought a total of 6 of these clocks, 2 in 1910, 2 in 1914, another 2 in 1916. And these were, to the best of my knowledge, these were used in the power generating station at the Long Island Railroad, Pennsylvania power station in New York City. And the reason why they're black, because at the time, I mean, if you go into your basement, most of your circuit breaker panels and everything are like battleship gray. But the turn of the last century, all the electrical panels were black, and all the electrical gauges, sorry about that, all the electrical gauges were made out of Bakelite, and the rest of the cabinets were black enamel, flat black enamel paint. So this would match up to the rest of the room. So I just thought this was kind of neat to show. Once again, there's a lot. You can find a clock at a show. You can call Chelsea. You can get a certificate of origin and something like this. You could, wow, this was sold to the Long Island Railroad in 1910. Let me see what else I can think about and figure out why it was used. And these are the conclusions I've come to. On the flip side, let's talking about an award clock. And of course, it's a sailboat, 1902. This was awarded to the Yankee, which was one of 4 Hershoff New York 70 boats that was designed. And, people that owned this, I think it was the Pratt family that owned the Yankee. The others that owned the other 3 New York 70 boats were families like Vanderbilt. So these were millionaire toys, and I don't mean to belittle it. This is an 8.5-inch ship's bell commander from 1902 that was a dedicated piece to the owners of the Yankee from the Seattle Corinthian Yacht Club. And I think this is a stunning clock. But that's just me. Military clocks. Chelsea was basically, as soon as they came into business in 1898, their Type E Marine clock was the best marine timekeeper out there. I'm not saying as a navigational timekeeper. I'm saying a marine clock that you can get, that you can hang on the wall. Seth Thomas, yes, had like a number 10 movement, very robust movement, was not the greatest in accuracy. The Chelsea time-only movements in 1898, they were saying they could be within plus or minus 2 minutes a week. The Navy Observatory brought some in, they adjusted them, and they got it a lot tighter than that from a tolerance. So up until about 1910, most Navy military Marine clocks that we're talking about were Chelsea. There were very few Seth Thomas because Seth Thomas could not compete with the timing and accuracy of the E movement until about 1910 when they came out with a round movement that looks a lot like an E movement with a whiz wheel or micrometric regulator right below the 12 that had the similar timing characteristics as the E movement, and they were able to sell that to the U.S. government, to the military. But a very inexpensive way to get into Chelsea clocks and military clocks. These are great. These This is an early message center clock. This is probably 1939. This is how, as I found it. I was able to get the case polished, remount it to the wood, and center it. And it's a great timekeeper. And I actually got one of these from my dad before he passed away. My father was in the Army Air Corps. He was based in the Philippines, and he had one of these on his desk. So I was able to restore one and give it to him before he passed. But these are out there. These are probably, once you leave this presentation, you walk the floor, you'll see something like this on the ground. And you get it for a couple $100. It's dynamite. And these will last generations. Anything with the name on the dial is always interesting to me. These are 4.5-inch Marine ship's bell clocks. This one's from about 1906. Notice how it has Arabic. This one's about 1902. This is a fully painted dial. This is painted here and painted name and engraved numbers. This one is also painted, engraved, and engraved. You can't go wrong. You find one of these. You can go into Rudder Magazine or Lloyd's Yacht Registry, search the name. Like I'll give you an example. Like the Cossack was from the Boston Yacht Club, and most of these were old sailing ships, except the Uno was actually a powered launch. And it's amazing what you could find. The stuff is digitized. You could use Google Books and search old Lloyd's Yacht Registry records. Here's an example, the Shia 4. The Shia 4 was the flagship of the Boston Yacht Club, owned by Commodore Alfred Douglas. So this is the clock off of that ship. And, early on, when you buy a clock from Chelsea, you purchase it directly, or you can buy it through, say, Larcher, L.A. Larcher and Company in Boston, which is a ship chandler. When you order, you can say, hey, this is for my boat, the Mississippi. And no additional charge, Chelsea would add your boat's name to the dial. One of my favorite clocks I picked up, it's another Commander. And this is a 4.5-inch Commander. John Bliss and Company, New York, ship's bell. This was from the 1909 season for the Class X, won by Slowpoke. And here is a picture of Slowpoke from 1908. And what's great about it, I'm from Brooklyn, and the Graves and Dory, the Slowpoke was a Brooklyn runabout. So for me, it's one of my favorite clocks, just because of the story. And I love clocks with stories. Now there are clocks with bad stories, like why doesn't it have this and why doesn't it have that? That's not the story we're talking. We're talking about clocks that have great stories. Things to look for. Anything that has a name on the dial, name on the bezel, John Bliss, New York. This happens to be, even though it says 1957, this is an early painted dial, probably from 1900, 1902. I picked this up from another collector years ago, and it says GA Saffron, Singapore. Anytime I see a clock that has a dealer from far away, typically, I've seen clocks with, a dealer from Buenos Aires. I've seen a few from the UK with UK dealers on them. I've never seen one from Singapore. And I found this bit here with compliments of GA Saffron, Special Dragon Works, Palace Hotel, Manning Road, and this is Singapore. And they had a head office in Belgium, and then a Sheffield branch opposite the Navy YMCA. And I find it interesting. You'll probably find something just like that at your regional. You can probably get it for $50. It's amazing what we could find at an NAWCC regional. I did not find that there. I found other things just as interesting. So I tell you, keep looking. Easiest way to get into the hobby is through military clocks because they, I'll give an example. Chelsea made about 390,000 clocks between 1898 and 1939. Between 39 and 48, they made another 250,000 clocks. Could be, bomb fuses and whatnot. But in 5-6 years, they made almost as many as they made in the first 40 years of their life. So if you want the least barrier to entry is to find a military clock. They're out there. Every one of them is high quality. The one on the right, this is almost World War One. This is World War II or newer, World War II or newer. The Bakelite came out in the mid 40s. Did in fact the strategic allocation of brass for munition purpose, for munition manufacturing. You can't go wrong. And just want to give you a salute from the Special Grand Isle Commander with their bezels out. And to give you an idea of my insanity, that's my living room on the left, and that is my office on the right, with things with springs that tick and strike. And I have one firewood clock right here. So, I'm not totally agnostic. Plus, I have a ton of wristwatches, which are never on display. They're usually on my wrist. So at this point, does anybody have any questions? I just don't hear anything. I have my volume up. I don't hear anything. Tim, are you there, or did Tim fall asleep?
Well, no questions here, Bill, but tell the story about the renaming of Chelsea from Boston Clock Company.
Well, I'll give you, it's not so much the renaming. Okay. Basically, John Eastman was an apprentice at E. Howard and left there in 1880 and started a company with other investors known as the Harvard Clock Company. And that ran for about 4 years, selling marine movements to steam gauge companies and making their own clocks and selling them. So one day he went to the barber to get a shave and a haircut, I would imagine. And sitting in the seat next to him was his old boss, E. Howard. And Howard said to Easton, it's very confusing. My customers are confused between Harvard Clock and Howard Clock. You should really change your name. And shortly thereafter, and this is kind of a hearsay, mythical story, but other things came to light later, such as there was a clock that was given to the local barber by Eastman as a thank you, and turned out to be the barber that both of these guys went to. So talking to Andy Demeter, he said, yeah, the story is real, it's true. And the clock is true. That is the barber clock. And I have that in my office now, but that's another story. So after that encounter, Eastman changed the name of the Harvard Clock Company to the Boston Clock Company. And the Boston Clock Company was in business for another 10 years, about 1895. And after that, things happened, and Eastman started the Eastman Clock Company, which survived for about a year or two. And then he moved out from Eastman, moved up to Vermont, and you'd hear about the Vermont Clock Company and the Fairhaven Clock Company. And those businesses were not extremely successful. Out of that, the Boston Clock Company of Maine was created. Meanwhile, Vermont stayed in business. And one thing led with the Boston Clock Company of Maine basically selling out. And a gentleman named Charles Pearson bought the Eastman Clock Factory that was in Chelsea, Massachusetts at bankruptcy, bought the remains of the Boston Clock Company of Maine, also at a bankruptcy. and started the Chelsea Clock Company in 1898. And to add a little bit more confusion, in 1909, the Chelsea Clock Company created the Boston Clock Company, a division of Chelsea Clocks. And they did that so they could sell different clocks, with the same clocks with slightly different grade of movement to government contracts. So it would not eat into their retail sales. So does that sort of help, Tim?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much, Bill.
Okay. I mean that's kind of hearsay. I would have, if you guys wanted to know more about that, I would have put a presentation together on that type of stuff to give you more hard facts. But this is how I know it off, basically the top of my head.
So,
does anybody have any questions or? Wow, it sounds like nobody. It was an okay presentation then.
yeah, it does. Everybody appreciates it. You're getting some claps.
Right on. We like that. Thank you.
And a bunch of people had to leave to go to the bathroom. So,
oh, that happens.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I should have cut it quicker.
Oh, no problem. All right, Bill. Well, thank you very much. I'll stop recording at this point.
Right on. Okay. I'm gonna cut out. Call me later and we'll catch up.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Right on. You bet. Have a great day. Have a great show.
Thanks.
You bet.